Sudan has entered the kind of phase where a war can look stuck on the surface and still be quietly changing underneath. That is why this headline matters so much. A top RSF commander has defected to the Sudanese army, and most people will hear that as just another battlefield update, just another switch of loyalties in a brutal civil war that has already dragged into its fourth year. But wars do not only change when cities fall or capitals flip. Sometimes they change when confidence breaks inside the machine itself. Sometimes the real turning point is not a new offensive. It is the moment when one of the men trusted to hold the line decides the line no longer makes sense. That is what makes this story dangerous, because the question is not just who defected. The deeper question is what that defection reveals about the structure of the RSF, the balance of the war, and the kind of phase Sudan may be entering next. The commander in question is Maj, General Al-Nur Ahmed Adam, also known as Al-Quba or Al-Nur Guba, one of the highest-ranking officers to leave the Rapid Support Forces since the war began in April 2023. AP reports that Sudan's army chief, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, personally welcomed him in northern state near the Egyptian border, a public signal that the military wants this move seen not as a routine surrender, but as a political and strategic moment. Reports also indicate that al-Nur fled RSF-held Darfur earlier in April with fighters and equipment, and local Sudan reporting says he moved with a convoy that may have included more than 100 vehicles. This is important because a defection matters far more when it is not just a man crossing sides, but a man crossing sides with armed capacity, local knowledge, and personal networks that can pull others with him. Now look at why he appears to have defected, because that is where the real story begins. AP says the break was reportedly linked to internal disputes over leadership roles after the RSF's seizure of El Fasher, with al-Nur angered after being denied command of North Darfur. That detail may sound small compared with the scale of Sudan's catastrophe, but in civil wars, rank disputes are rarely just personal. They are usually about access to territory, supply lines, patronage, tribal leverage, and the right to command men and resources in a war zone where power is often more local than national. In other words, this defection does not just suggest disappointment. It suggests fracture. It suggests that even after major battlefield gains in Darfur, the RSF may be carrying internal tensions that victory did not solve. And that is often when armed coalitions become most dangerous to themselves, not when they are losing everything, but when success creates a fight over who owns the success. That is why viewers should resist the lazy version of this story. The lazy version says, one commander defected, so the RSF must be collapsing. That is too simple. Sudan's war is not operating like a normal frontline conflict with neat chains of command and clean national structures. It is a fragmented war built on rival power centers, regional strongholds, outside sponsors, and overlapping networks of loyalty. Al Jazeera reported just days ago that as the war enters its fourth year, neither side has achieved a decisive victory. The army has regained major ground in Khartoum and central Sudan, and life has partially returned in some recaptured areas, but the military deadlock continues, especially in Kordofan, while Darfur remains the center of deepening humanitarian catastrophe. So this defection should not be treated as the end of the RSF. It should be treated as a signal that one of the war's most important armed structures may be less stable internally than it still looks from the outside. And that signal matters because this is not the first time a senior RSF figure has switched sides. Sudan Tribune says al-Nur's move mirrors the 2024 defection of Abu Akla Kekel, another high-profile RSF commander whose departure was followed by battlefield setbacks for the paramilitary force in Gezira state. That earlier example matters not because history always repeats exactly, but because it shows what these defections can do in Sudan's war. They can break local command coherence, expose rivalries, shift territorial momentum, and puncture the image of inevitability that every armed group tries to project. Armed organizations survive as much on perception as on ammunition. Fighters need to believe their commanders are united, their leadership is advancing, and their sacrifices still connect to a larger direction. When high-ranking men begin leaving, especially after disputes over prestige and control, the psychological damage can spread wider than the tactical loss. But here is the darker side of the story. Fractures inside a force do not automatically make the war safer. In fact, they can make it more vicious. When centralized control weakens, violence often becomes more localized, more retaliatory, and more unpredictable. Sudan is already suffering one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. AP reported last week that the war has forced about 13 million people from their homes, while UN officials say the broader displacement burden has reached around 14 million. AP also says at least 59,000 people have been killed, while other humanitarian reporting places the death toll far higher. Around 34 million people now need assistance. Famine has spread in parts of the country, and the World Health Organization says only a portion of health facilities remain fully or partly functional. This is the environment into which this defection lands. So the question is not only whether the RSF has been weakened. The question is, what kind of violence follows when a force under pressure starts questioning itself from within? To understand why al-Noor's move is so sensitive, you have to understand where it happened politically, not just militarily. Darfur is no longer simply one battlefield among many. It is the core of the RSF's remaining strategic depth. AP says Sudan is now essentially divided between a military-backed government controlling much of the north, east, and central regions, and an RSF-centered rival authority entrenched in Darfur and parts of Kordofan. Those western regions are not just empty rear areas. They contain vital routes, border access, gold-producing zones, and the social terrain from which the RSF historically draws a large part of its strength. If a major commander tied to North Darfur breaks from the movement after a dispute over command, the damage is not just symbolic. It touches the geography where the RSF most needs internal discipline. That is why this story matters much more than its headline size might suggest. It is not a footnote to the war, it is a clue about the war's internal stress lines, and those stress lines appear at a very dangerous moment. Sudan has just entered its fourth year of war with diplomacy weak, humanitarian funding badly short, and international attention drifting. The Guardian reported that only a small fraction of the aid needed for 2026 had been funded by mid-April, even as acute hunger spread, hospitals shut down, and drone warfare intensified. AP described the conflict as an abandoned crisis, noting that other global emergencies have pulled attention away, while Sudan's war keeps grinding through its population. That matters because long wars become harder to stabilize when the outside world stops treating them as urgent. In that kind of vacuum, battlefield logic grows stronger, commanders act more autonomously, and every local shift can become more consequential because there are fewer diplomatic breaks. A defection under those conditions is not just a military story. It is a warning that the war may keep evolving faster than the peace process. There is another reason this matters. The RSF has always tried to project itself not merely as a militia, but as an alternative center of Sudanese power, militarily durable, politically adaptable, and regionally connected. But a force can seize cities and still suffer from internal contradictions. It can look unstoppable in one province and insecure in its command culture at the same time. AP's reporting suggests al-Noor's break came after being sidelined in the post-El Fasher order. That tells you the conflict inside the RSF may not only be about ideology or war aims, it may also be about spoils, hierarchy, regional prestige, and who gets to rule the wreckage. That is often the hidden problem in hybrid armed movements. Their expansion brings them more territory, but it also forces them to decide who commands which territory, who gets rewarded, and whose networks are elevated. If those questions are mishandled, battlefield victories can generate political instability inside the winning side itself. That is why the most important part of this story is not that a commander defected to the army. The most important part is that he defected after the RSF had already demonstrated strength in Darfur. If a force is losing badly everywhere, defections are expected. But if a senior figure defects after his side has gained important ground and consolidated territorial control, that suggests something more corrosive than fear. It suggests disillusionment. It suggests rivalry. It suggests that some commanders may not trust the internal bargain anymore. And once that begins, the danger expands beyond one man. Fighters begin asking who else is unhappy. Allies begin asking whether today's commander might become tomorrow's defector. Civilian communities begin wondering whether the men claiming to rule them are even aligned among themselves. That kind of doubt does not instantly decide a war, but it changes the texture of power. It makes every next shock more plausible. Still, there is a trap here, and it is the same trap that swallows so many war narratives online. People see one dramatic move and assume the larger strategic answer has arrived. It has not. Sudan remains a country split between rival armed systems, devastated infrastructure, shattered civilian life, and a war economy that rewards continuation more than compromise. AP says the army's recapture of Khartoum and other central urban areas in early 2025 allowed about 4 million people to return to their homes, but even that return has not meant real normality. Al Jazeera says life in the capital has only returned to a fragile kind of near normal, with severe uncertainty and worsening living conditions. So this is not a story where one high-profile defection suddenly restores national order. It is a story where one defection may tell us which side's internal contradictions are becoming harder to hide. That is a much more serious and much more useful way to read it. And if the RSF's contradictions are becoming harder to hide, the next phase of the war may not look like sudden peace. It may look like fragmentation. That is often the more dangerous path. A force under strain can become harsher, more decentralized, and more dependent on local commanders proving their worth through violence. It can double down on coercion to discourage further defections. It can tighten its social control in the areas it holds. It can launch attacks not only for military effect, but to reassert authority inside its own ranks. None of that is guaranteed, but it is exactly the kind of risk analysts watch for when high-level defections happen inside irregular or semi-regular forces. And because Darfur remains one of the epicenters of both the war and the famine emergency, any new instability inside the RSF's Western command structure could have consequences far beyond battlefield maps. It could hit civilians first and hardest. There is also the international dimension, and it makes this defection more than a local drama. AP reports growing evidence that outside powers continue backing rival sides behind the scenes, with Egypt aligned more closely with the army and the UAE accused by UN experts and rights groups of supporting the RSF, a charge Abu Dhabi rejects. AP also reported just days ago that Washington sanctioned individuals and firms accused of recruiting Colombian mercenaries to fight alongside the RSF. That tells you Sudan's war is still plugged into a wider network of money, logistics, influence, and proxy behavior. In that environment, a commander's defection is never only domestic. It affects how sponsors read the viability of their partners. It affects whether outside backers feel they need to stabilize, escalate, or hedge. And wars become even harder to end when external players start recalculating at the same moment internal fractures become visible. So what does this actually mean? It means Sudan may be entering a phase where the biggest changes are not necessarily the loudest ones. Yes, cities and front lines still matter. Yes, the army and RSF remain locked in a brutal national struggle that no single defection can resolve. But when a top commander walks away from one of the war's most powerful armed actors after a dispute over rank, Darfur command, and post-victory control, the event should be read as a structural signal. It says the RSF is not only fighting the army. It may also be wrestling with itself, and in long wars, internal fractures can matter as much as battlefield defeats, because they tell you whether a force can convert territorial power into lasting cohesion. If it cannot, then every apparent victory may carry the seed of future weakness inside it. That is why this story should not be framed as cheap optimism or simple war drama. It is neither. It is not proof that the war is ending. It is not proof that the army has won. And it is certainly not proof that Sudan's civilians are about to be saved from the nightmare they have already endured for 3 years. What it is, instead, is a rare glimpse into the internal pressure building inside one of the two forces that have torn the country apart. Sudan's tragedy has always been bigger than any one commander, any one city, or any one offensive. But wars like this eventually turn on confidence, cohesion, and the ability of armed movements to keep their own internal bargains intact. Al-Nur Ahmed Adam's defection matters because it suggests one of those bargains may be cracking. And when a crack appears inside a force that holds so much ground, so many guns, and so many frightened civilians under its shadow, the next chapter of the war can change very quickly.